I'm so pleased to turn the podium over to her and to welcome her and to say to her, thank you for coming. And this will circulate as she's talking.
Thank you, Suki, for that lovely, lovely introduction. And I have that up here. And so it's very nice that you were able to read and, kind of orient the speech in such a lovely way. Lost Without Translation, Telling the Stories of a Silenced People. My paper should be titled Lost in Translation, as my focus is going to be on that which gets missed, obscured, or denied in the various translation activities that takes place when languages shift from word to word, from one mouth to another, finding expression in other dialects, syntaxes, and expositions. I'm going to speak of the resistances, prohibitions, and censorship, many times self-imposed, which occur when translation happens. Translations are never transparent activities, even though immediately after the activity has taken place, the translation passes itself off as the truthful, fully formed singular version, reflecting back an image that is the correct one, as if the mirror has been turned around, allowing the reader to now make sense of what was upside down before. My hesitations and criticisms about the sleight of hand magic that happened with translation is not new. In the West, with its long history of translating the classics, the warning has been rung out periodically. Jean-Pierre Vermont, in his now classic essay on Greek tragedy, claims that, quote, when we are dealing with a very ancient culture, far removed from us, there is no possibility of an exact translation. Vermont's argument is that not knowing the contingencies prevailing at the moment when the Greek tragic poet wrote his play, we cannot actually know how much about the play itself is. It's about the play itself, as, quote, words carry a meaning which are not translatable. Whereas Vermont is concerned with 5th century BCE Athens, I argue that even in the most modern times, it is not possible to translate what might otherwise be taken for the most mundane of discourses. Because even the most expert translators, they're the ones who get to put their name down on paper, need translators, that most slippery, fluid, and mysterious figure in modern history. The Sri Lankan diaspora writer Shobha Sakti's first novel, Gorilla, opens with what may seem at first glance like a copy of his original application for refugee status in France. The name Yakapu Anthony Dasan is the given name of Shobha Sakti, and in his various interviews since the novel came out in Tamil in 2001, he has shown a careful consistency in describing the arc of his journey from being a child soldier with the Tamil militants to becoming a political refugee in France. He insists on calling Gorilla as, you said, an autofiction, as opposed to a memoir. When he was interviewed for the Indian magazine Platform after the English version of Gorilla was published in 2008, a written interview where the reporter emailed me questions in English, which I translated for Shobha Sakti into Tamil verbally over the phone, and then again translated into English once Shobha Sakti sent me the written answers in Tamil. This is what Shobha Sakti says about the incidents described in the novel. Gorilla is an autofiction. I wrote my story blending my own experiences and the experiences of others like me with the militant movement and early years in France as a refugee. But the political incidents in the novel, the murderous attacks by the Sri Lankan government and the Tigers upon the people, and the way the French authorities treat refugees as despicable human beings are true. They are factual, even in terms of the dates given in the novel. The murder that is described at the end of the novel is also an actual assassination. On May Day 1994, one of the early leaders of the Ulam struggle was shot dead in his own house. Sadly, Platform, like many of the other Indian magazines that did similar interviews with him, in its published piece on Shobha Sakti, found it more interesting, and this points to its understanding of its metropolitan English readership, to focus on the personal, present-day details about Shobha Sakti, former militant now washes dishes in Paris for a living kind of titillation, rather than the political indictments Shobha Sakti makes against the powerful state apparatuses of Sri Lanka, France, and India. The cover of the original Gorilla has the English word fiction in bright yellow placed below its Tamil title. In the English version of the novel, its Indian editors present the novel as more or less autobiographical, leaving out all references to the fictional elements of the book. In wanting to keep the focus on the protagonist, the editors cut out whole sections of the novel, including the assassination Shobha Sakti mentions in the platform interview. What was most distressing, the sections of the novel that dealt with female characters that might complicate commonplace understandings of gender. For instance, the protagonist, Rocky Raja's younger sister, Prince's suicide bomb attack and the killing of the prostitute Salangay by the militants were also excised from the English publication. Too distracting for the English reader, I was told. This was not all that was left out. The Indian editors, over my protests, cut out the device of numbering in the English edition to allow for a more streamlined reading. The Tamil Gorilla, which opens with this petition of clearly numbered paragraphs, that is a strict linear narration of events organized in terms of dates, time, and place, keeps this model of numbering in the rest of the novel, where all the paragraphs in the novel are numbered in a systematic fashion. This numbering that the novel insists on doing until its last page signals to the reader that something is amiss. For after all, there are generic conventions that need to be followed in any novel. What is commonplace in one kind of genre, the official bureaucratic discourses that privilege the objective, non-figurative style, draw attention when it appears elsewhere. Significantly, this numbering of the paragraphs is all that the novel keeps from its opening petition. For the rest of Gorilla shifts between places, time periods, and narrative voices, refusing to hold itself down to any kind of linear organization. As the novel moves on, the reader realizes that the petition itself is a self-conscious, creative piece of writing, like the rest of the novel. For in spite of its various signs and symbols signifying to its truth factor, the numbering being one of them, the petition is filled with ambiguities of one kind or another. As Shobha Sakti says in his interviews repeatedly, all refugee petitions to the West begin with a lie. You are automatically disqualified if you have ever carried a gun. What is a child soldier to do? When the numbering does not stop with the petition but continues counting off each paragraph like a leak that won't stop, the reader is made to acknowledge the sheer arbitrariness of the act of numbering itself. Why is the refugee required to number every paragraph? The numbers are present in the petition to allow for the administrator to whom the petition is addressed to refer to the contents of the petition in an efficient manner. The numbering makes it clear that the narration that happens in the petition is for bureaucratic reasons only, to be assessed, evaluated for truth content, and judged to be adequate or not by an official entity. The numbering is in place for the convenience of the interlocutor, in this case, the director of the Office of French Political Asylum, to easily refer to the document in his justifications. It is a reasonable rhetorical device that provides the addresser and the addressee with their specific roles in this institutionalized encounter. Whereas in oral cultures, the storyteller assumes a place of power in being able to hold the attention of the audience, the very format of the petition announces that it is a written product packaged with ancillary material, as the narration alone is meaningless. The various linguistic and rhetorical marks scattered all over the document points to the hierarchy built into the communication, even as it provides a sense of the communicative nature of the document. For after all, it is a letter, and therefore made to conform to certain epistolary conventions. But even though the placement of the date, the salutations, and other such visual clues would identify the petition as a letter, written and mailed voluntarily by the addresser, it is not part of a dialogue or a discourse between equals. The petition is also a narrative organized in a clearly identifiable fashion where the numbering is meant to convey the sense of the linearity of the narrative. It is as if the director to whom the appeals are addressed recognizes the difficulty or the impossibility of describing in clear terms the horrors of war that the refugees have witnessed and is helping them by providing a particular format to organize the experiences. After all, As Elaine Scully has argued, language becomes inadequate, silent in the face of describing the carnage of war. How does one describe seeing dead children, decapitated bodies, and burned homes? Either one begins to focus on the horror and insist upon describing the terror of the human being's inability to process such experiences in a meaningful fashion, which evolves into being the provinces of literature and therapy, or one becomes silent. Both these reactions are prohibited in the refugee appeal. The format refuses what it defines as a surplus, the vocalized anguish, the confusions of time and space, the gaps in knowledge, the irrationality of wartime behavior, which are common human responses to unimaginable horror, as being counterproductive to the mission of getting at the unvarnished truth. But if we assume that the numbering performs the hierarchical arrangement of the information from beginning to end, say, with the information presented in order of importance, then how do we understand paragraph 6, the one here, where even before narrating the series of misfortunes that brought him to France as a political refugee, the writer bursts into what is unequivocally an argument refusing to adhere to the conventions of asylum petition writing. I was going to read this, but you've already read it, so I'm just going to leave it there. Okay, this is the second part. The ethos of the writer is clearly present at the beginning of the petition itself, providing the asylum granting officer with a framework of a barely concealed arrogance to deal with as the rest of the document is read. The petitioner Anthony Dawson asserts himself, points to the inadequacies of the asylum process, and in doing so draws attention to the weakness of a powerful national institution. On a side note, the OFPRA has been criticized repeatedly for how few applications it entertains in a positive fashion. Human rights activists point out that the onus is put upon the refugees to pay for a translator at every stage of the official process. So, I can either read this paragraph as a defiance born of despair, like the young black male wearing saggy pants, insisting the bourgeoisie to read in his sorry state that of his brother in prison, that is, as an act of last-stage hopelessness, or as a sign of reckless hubris. There are two kinds of languages that are present in Anthony Dawson's petition. The straightforward factual narration of a report, that is, the truth demanded by the authorities, and this insistently dialogic voice with its accusatory, you quote, and your explanation. I'm using Bakhtin's formulation of the struggle between the centralizing univocal monologic language of the state with the languages of the lesser powerful. This refugee, like all refugees, is a problem for the Western nation. And in his petition, he is asked to set out in detail his journey to the gates of France. To put it simply, the asylum seeker is asked to provide an explanation of how he became a problem for his own state, through no fault of his own. It is his innocence that he is asked to display in every turn of phrase of the petition. In his petition, Anthony Dawson replays the problem he is to the Western nation. He is insolent, demanding, and worse, reasonable. I'm reminded of Sophocles' Antigone, arguing with Creon, calling his laws mere proclamations of the heralds and not the laws of the nation at all. It is an act of breathtaking risk and foolishness too, for though we agree with Antigone in the justice of her claim, as we do with Anthony Dawson, as an act of persuasion, such speech is deeply counterproductive. One does not call the arresting officer a pig if one wishes to be let off with a warning. There is definitely hubris here, an incautiousness that will prove dangerous. If I were a Greek chorus, I would begin my wailing at this juncture, pointing out that even if Anthony Dawson had reason enough for his angry criticism, this speech is not pathos, that is, the only speech allowed to him, but nomoi, law-driven, based upon logic, and only allowed to those in power to make. As Plutarch has pointed out, women were not allowed in public life in Athens, as they were seen as lacking rationality, or logos, the province of the elite male. Nomoi referred to the models of civic behavior, and as a non-citizen and alien, like the Greek women, Anthony Dawson also is denied the right to it. The Greek chorus tells Antigone, Poor child, you have shown excessive audacity, and you have flung yourself violently against the throne of justice. They might say the same to Anthony Dawson. As Aristotle defines in his Poetics, the Greek tragedy did not allow for ethos, which is meant only for those who represented contemporary mores, like the elite men who were chosen to play the chorus. The tragedy allowed for only two kinds of characters, the women and ancient heroes, both absent from current Greek politics, who debated on stage. Modern commentators, from Hegel onwards, the most recent being Judith Butler, have grappled with the figure of Antigone, of how she is allowed to speak, but only as a character on stage. She is not a real person. For ethos is underwritten by power and is the province of the elite Western male who is careful to segregate civic spaces. He is the chorus, judging and commenting on the tragic figures before him. Given that Aristotle's rhetoric, the primordial base of Western education for the aristocracy until the Renaissance, is still in place in its varying guises, bear with me as I read further into Anthony Dawson's petition using Aristotle's terminology. Aristotle, who set out the various forms of persuasive methods for a successful rhetor, the choosing and organizing of the different proofs, the styles, and the devices for memory and delivery, also points out that it is the audience who decides in matters of public speech, the genus of the speech, the kind of audience a speech is directed at, whether a jury, a civic committee, or the general populace of a city-state, decide whether the speech they hear is a juridical, legislative, or ceremonial speech. More importantly, it is the audience or the addressee who also decides on the ethos of the speaker, whether a speaker has high ethos or low ethos. Foucault's famous question, who is allowed to speak, is but a careful explanation of the modern West's legitimation of what it regards as ethos. So, why does Anthony Dawson take this risk? It is a suicidal act which seems to come out of nowhere, so unlike the passivity he displayed in the war zones back home, as is made clear in the rest of the petition. The sophists taught their oratory students the concept of kairos, or the identifying of the right moment in a speech. The word is opposed to chronos, or linear time, in the sense of kairos being that particular moment the speaker seizes to hammer his point through. Actors call it timing. When the speaker reads the mood of the audience, calibrates the speech perfectly, and makes time slow down or quicken as a particular viewpoint engages the audience in a persuasive fashion. Kairos is when the able speaker seizes time and makes it work effectively for him. In Anthony Dawson's case, he is not allowed to be this being, the speaker allowed to use all his faculties. Anthony Dawson's speech is what the official bodies would call illegitimate, as he is an illegal immigrant, a refugee, a beggar at the gate. He is not allowed to seize the moment, for to do so would then make him a subject, an active agent. The petition provides Anthony Dawson with inadequate containers. For if we imagine each of the numbered paragraphs as a space to pour his story in, for they are meant to be as shallow as possible to refuse expressive language. So, to repeat my question, why does Anthony Dawson fly in the face of fate? Quote, my lawyer advised me to add in my petition that there are new dangers to my life, and that such a statement would make my petition stronger. I'm very sorry to say that at this point there are no new dangers. Even before he describes his war experiences of torture, beatings, shootings, and more torture back in Sri Lanka, a list that by following the prescribed format might soften the authorities to read his appeal in a more sympathetic fashion, Anthony Dawson stands up and kicks away the shallow containers and brings in his own expressive language, the reported speech, the imagined dialogue, the figures of speech, and worse, the direct addressing of the French administrator. He calls the French authorities that he finds their requirements foolish. He employs a particular form of logic, knowing that it is a powerful weapon denied to him. The only reason I can think of is that Anthony Dawson, living on the edge, acts in a risky manner precisely because of his position. As openly indicated in his address at the top of the letter, he's writing from someone else's home in Paris, France. He's living on borrowed space and time, occupying a borderland, what Victor Turner has called a liminal space. Turner's description of what one might call border crossing is very useful in our attempt to understand Anthony Dawson's ethos-driven argument. Even while keeping in mind that for Turner, liminality refers to a state of being in cultural suspension more than the actual crossing of international borders, nevertheless, the description fits Anthony Dawson because he's in fact occupying a cultural as well as physical space of limbo, being neither a legal resident of France nor of Sri Lanka. According to Turner, this blurring and merging of distinctions during a processual rite from one identity to another allows for a freedom on the part of the border crosser to act in new ways. In Shobha Sakti's latest film script, Passport, the young illegal immigrant to France, while being taken to the airport to be deported back to Sri Lanka, jumps away from the border guards literally into the air, an act of such colossal risk that no one had expected it of him, least of all his guards. The refugee appeals construct the West as places where universal reason reigns. Standing on its borders, these refugees describe the disorder in their own homelands in painful detail and beg the West for succor. Each time the appeal is refused, the description gets worked on, its rough edges identified and polished for resubmission. In this encounter, in the writing that forms the contours of the encounter, the imperial histories of these almost always former colonial powers are described as benign forces of good, ironically reflecting back and reinforcing the same rhetoric of the civilizing models of sweetness and light these nations adopted in their post-Columbian colonial adventures. These documents, always written and translated in the language of the dominant cultures, provide the host nation with a flattering description of itself as a land of stability and plenty, in contrast to the dark places the refugees have left behind. The other comes begging for inclusion and performs acts of assimilation at every turn, beginning with the application, where the terms of the encounter are preset by the host nation. Any attempt at manipulating this communication model is forestalled by the host nation refusal of rhetoric. By rhetoric, I'm going back to the classical definition of persuasion by any means, in a word, eloquence. For the classical teachers of rhetoric, metaphor played a primary role in persuasive speech. Variously defined as types of ornamentation, metaphor has had a rocky history, reviled and revered in turn by its users and detractors. For Aristotle, the metaphor is that which makes strange, where the familiar language moves from the known to the unknown. This move from one place to another, signaling the intrusion of the foreign into the local, is a dangerous act, for it has the potential to destabilize the linguistic enterprise. Eric Chaffetz points out that the implicit xenophobia in resisting such a move cannot be denied. Remember that for the Greeks, the barbarian was one who spoke an unintelligible language that sounded like barbar. Aristotle describes a style of language filled with metaphors as a riddle or an enigma, speech that is opaque, unclear, and liable to multiple interpretations. Hence, as Bakhtin has argued, the state requires and presents its standard language as the univocal, legitimate, proper, and only language in the name of clarity. In these applications, eloquence is curtailed in the name of efficiency and truth. First, the host nation demands that the other who approaches its gates to declare himself as a victim in every sense. He has to begin with the fiction that he had never carried a weapon, and that in every instance of his being caught in the war, he was an innocent bystander and never an active participant. The pure and innocent victim is the only role allowed to the refugee. If she has lost a leg, it was because she stepped on a landmine while going to fetch water. If she has an eye missing, it was from flying shrapnel when her village was attacked. The messiness of life in a civil war, of any kind of resistance in what might conceivably be a civic group, let's imagine, that was minimally organized to provide some form of protection within a particular region, would make the refugee automatically disqualified as an asylum seeker. Jill Lepore, in her book The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, describes the fallout from the 1677 rebellion of the early Native American tribes. After the war, the passive communities of the Christianized Native Americans were put on ships as slaves and sent away from the New England states. These ships were denied entry at the Caribbean ports where they were bound, as hearing of the war, both Barbados and Jamaica had passed legislation against the buying of Native Americans from the warring states of New England, for fear they might bring civil unrest to their own slave plantations. We have no extant record of where these ships unloaded their sad cargo of starving and terrorized Native Americans. By all accounts, these people were never part of any uprising, as they had spent the war quarantined in a sandy island off the coast where many died without adequate food and clothing over the winter. During their incarceration, they wrote pathetic appeals to their pastor who had converted them to Christianity, and the appeals remain as testament to their helplessness. As the colonials felt that no Indian was innocent, with the oft-repeated slogan of "the only good Indian is a dead Indian," their appeals fell on deaf ears. The Supplicants Tale is told at the prompting of the master. It is an imperative gesture made towards the refugee. If you wish to enter, she is told, translate your tale into one that will fit our requirements, our sense of propriety. In the classical tradition, there's a familiar tale of a man as a creature, barely human until he is taught to speak properly. Once the correct form of speech is acquired, he becomes eloquent. His voice and his ability to speak and be heard are dependent on acquiring the right way to speak. In the West, as Roland Barthes has argued, this ability to speak with power was invested with desire, where the power of persuasion was taught and kept within the ruling elite. When Anthony Dawson wrests this power for himself, he becomes a tragic figure. In his appeal, when he dares to use the allegory, the extended metaphor of the army owning up to its excesses, to argue the impossibility of providing the written proof the French authorities want, he plays on the ridiculousness of this expectation as being similar to expecting the army, the ultimate symbol of state power, to own up to its excesses by giving the victim written proof. It is a brilliant argument. But it is at this moment in the petition that we see the whole tragic past, present, and future of Anthony Dawson. We do not need to read anymore. We already know what the answer the director of the Office of Asylum Seekers is going to send him. Nothing good will come out of Anthony Dawson's use of chaos, which will be read by his addressee as intransigence. Caught in the conflict between the penitent pose expected of the refugee and the paternal power wielded by the gatekeeper, Anthony Dawson's hubris will lead to his tragic end. I use the word tragic because this moment in the life of Anthony Dawson has arrived after he has spent another lifetime elsewhere. The suffering that happened before is now being used as a justification to request entry into another land. And in order to be allowed to change self-identity from Sri Lankan Tamil to French refugee, Anthony Dawson needs to enunciate what it means to be a Sri Lankan Tamil. The petition is not a confessional of remorse, self-doubt, or guilt. To express any of these emotions in however minimal fashion would negate its persuasiveness as an appeal for asylum. By the same token, this pathos has to be written in the language that has traditionally been the province of Logos, linear, unsentimental, numbered bullet points of reasons for asylum. The refugee is required to provide a logical summary of experiences that had taken place in a war zone. It is the responsibility of the subject to make sense of his experiences for those in power. He cannot dump all his impressions, half-forgotten terrors, fragmented memories, and images of blood and gore in front of his interlocutor and ask him to make coherent meaning out of it. The logic underlying the writing of this petition is the logic of identity. For the host nation, you are either a pure refugee, and the border official knows to recognize each and every one of those signs and tick off all that fits the known descriptions of innocence, or you are not. Because now you are a malingerer, a militant, a mustachioed freeloader, come to eat us out of our abode. According to the logic of identity, the West is organized necessarily along this logic. One cannot simply occupy an indeterminate place whose contradictions cannot be overcome. One cannot be a former child soldier now searching for a home like Anthony Dawson. His petition is a carefully constructed series of events that both took place and did not. Even his name, Yakubu, refers to an earlier translation where the anglicized Jacob becomes the Tamil Yakubu, pronounced like the Hebrew Jacob. Anthony becomes Anthony Dawson, which means a devotee of the Saint Anthony, the local patron saint of Anthony Dawson's village in a tiny island off the coast of northern Sri Lanka. Therefore, when Anthony Dawson claims in such a univocal fashion, I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil, he is presenting a centralized identity provided by the state of Sri Lanka as well as the official apparatuses of the refugee lands, but one that is without much meaning within the Sri Lankan Tamil community. Anthony Dawson is from Mandetivu, an island person in local parlance with his own kinship rituals, linguistic identifications, and cultural references from mainstream northern Sri Lanka or Jaffna proper. Here are the opening lines of Shobha Sakti's short story Barabbas, where he maps an imaginary place called Sandhyapulam, the setting of the story that is but a thinly veiled description of his own birthplace, Allepiti. The Mandetivu of Anthony Dawson is but another iteration of his lost island home. And I'm going to read this passage. If you started walking northwards from Karamban through the wild vegetation for about 15 minutes, you would notice the earth dissolving. Gradually, the rocky soil becomes muddy, then a marshland, which turns into a soft sand, and you would arrive at what is a tiny bit of wasteland. This land on the shores of Tambati Sea is called Sandhyapulam. Long ago, in the middle of this coastal land, there was a St. Thomas church. Long ago, on the eastern road of this coastal land, there was a co-op store. Long ago, right next to the church, there was a Roman Catholic mixed school. Long ago, on the beach of this coastal island, there was a toddy shop. Long ago, the people of Sandhyapulam were deeply religious and lazy. Notice the direct addressing of the reader, the specificity of the geographical markers that are drawn through the eyes of a local inhabitant whose only way to think of this place is through memory, and a mythic one at that. Long ago is opposed to the you of the present time reading the story. Would you find this land again if you were to use the coordinates given here? Or would I, the narrator, the inhabitant of that land long ago? This is narration at its most powerful. It is a narration that cannot happen under the conditions of the refugee appeal. Anthony Dawson recognizes that the numbering is a quantifying device to provide order to memory, an overt method of containment where fluency is truncated. So when he bursts forth in angry argument, he is refusing the logic of the power relationship he is in, the strategies employed, the censuring, containing, and the chronological ordering translate the narrative of the refugee into the language of the state. And we see this language in its most basic form in the police report, where events and experiences are translated into the official language of the state. And a copy of the police report of atrocities committed, by the way, is valid proof in the appeals process. Once again, Elaine Scarry's theories about what pain does to language are illuminating. According to Scarry, for the sufferer, the language is either silenced or it bursts forth violently, silencing everything else. The appeal application does away with both forms of responses as it asks for sober order and corroboration. It is, after all, an official record of individual pain, of the pain inflicted upon this or that person, forcing each person to claim a communal experience as an individual experience. The land of refuge demands that the refugee bring order to herself. The notions of this order are placed from outside. If a refugee comes with a story that does not fit the official version, it is then cut and made to fit. Interestingly, there is no mention of property loss in these reports, or even a hint about it would raise flags about economic reasons for migration. The refugees are paradesi, bodies that wander with no house or land to call their own. S. Ponnuture, the Sri Lankan Dalit writer who was forced into exile in the early 1980s, begins his autobiography by referring to folks like himself as paradesi. All that the refugee can call upon is the memories and a scarred body, a conflation of the homeless body with identity. The following is a scene from the film script that I referred to before, Passport, about a typical scene between an officer and a young man, Armstrong. And let me read. The refugee interview room. A white officer is conducting the interview. Armstrong tells his story. The officer listens with a look of skepticism on his face. Armstrong shows the wound on his foot and explains that he got it by stepping on a landmine. Says the officer. It looks more like it was run over by a tractor. If you step on a landmine, you would know what it looks like, retorts Armstrong. The officer utters a contemptuous laugh and claims to have seen numerous landmine cases in Iraq and Afghanistan. Quote, those were American-made bombs. This was a local product by the LTTE, cries Armstrong. The officer tells him that he would give him a little money for now to go to the hospital to get that hand seen to, that it will take a few days for a decision to be made on his refugee application. But before that, the responsibility to provide papers to prove that he was a citizen of Sri Lanka was on him. Armstrong casually takes the knife out of his shoe and puts it in his pocket, asking the officer if there was a chance that his application might get rejected. When he sees the penknife, the officer turns to the translator and asks him something in a low voice, to which the translator replies, one of them even hung himself in this room and mimes a hand squeezing his neck and sticks his tongue out. The official narrative appears in the illegal applications. It is told in border camps to translators, to UN administrators, the directors of state-run refugee programs. It is marked by lies and desire. The official sniffs its lines, trying to separate one from the other. The other narrative, the oral narrative, is a communal one and is marked by imperial and patriarchal violence. It remains underground, rarely translated. The politics of intercultural and intracultural communication is such that the role of the translator, even the expert translator, needs another medium in order to even partially pass the language. The idea that somehow translation takes place, that the words on the page or those uttered by the subject is making sense, is a fiction kept alive by the same politics of power. The problem of translation, the complicated interactions between cultural groups with different linguistic and socio-cultural histories, is always announced at the moment of the translation and then denied. It reflects the parameters and the larger historical understanding of the differences, the very asymmetrical natures between oral and written cultures. When I met Smrita Narula, the author of Broken People, Caste Violence Against India's Untouchables, at a conference on Human Rights Watch work in South Asia, I asked her about the testimonies by the Tamil Dalits in her book. And she said, I wrote every single word by hand. I believe her. But who told her what to write? There was a translator or translators traveling with the Human Rights Watch group as they went from village to village gathering these testimonies. Who were these translators? Were they urbanized Tamils who belonged to dominant caste groups? Were they men from the village? Were they men from the other village? Each of these situations would complicate the narrative the witness is willing to share. I remember an incident at the 1987 All India Women's Conference in Patna, Bihar, where a group of urban feminists, most of them from Delhi and Bombay, were speaking to a group of Tamil Dalit women. How do you deal with rape in your village? Asked someone, and the Dalit women quite innocently replied that their village council would insist on the rapist marrying his victim. The feminists were outraged. The Tamil women tried to explain that often the young couple would have planned on the rape as a method to thwart parental opposition to their union. No, what about real rape? Say a married man raping a young girl. The Dalit women were silent and discomfited, as they knew the answer, marriage as a second or third wife even, would once again draw criticism from the city folks. I have thought of this moment often, for I was translating some of the conversation and had admittedly been horrified at the thought of a victim being made to marry her rapist. I realized much later that when the women from the north asked the Dalit women about rape in their South Indian village, a village civilly divided according to caste, with the Dalit section being called the Cheri, segregated and away from the village proper, the Tamil women answered the question narrowly of the cases of Dalit men raping Dalit women in their Dalit village. They did not even mention the larger horror, the rape of Dalit women by the so-called upper castes, where the crime almost always goes unremarked. Maybe they did not speak of such rape because I was the translator and they knew that I was not a Dalit. And I say this because of another incident. When I worked in Tamil villages as an adult educator, I remember traveling to a small village called Karadikal, which means Bear's Rock, near Tirumangalam, Madurai, and getting off the bus and being met by two Dalit women. I needed to walk a mile or so to get to the village, and the Dalit women insisted that we wait for women from one of the martial castes from the region to accompany us. Afterwards, when I repeated the claim of the Dalit women about definite rape on the path, the non-Dalit women were incredulous. We have never heard of any such incident, they insisted. The Dalit women remained stone-faced. How could they say, it is your men, your brothers and fathers and husbands who prey on us? The question of the urban feminists that assumed certain definitions of rape, juridical mainly, is made meaningless within the lived context of the Tamil Dalit. For the Dalit women speaking with the urban feminists, their speech translated by another urbanized Tamil, the question of rape by the dominant castes could not even enter the conversation as it was too dangerous. The Dalit women are right to fear that the urban women, the translator included, might turn on these women for implying that there is another kind of rape. The Dalit women were not wrong because the women from the martial castes, women who lived within calling distance of the Dalit women and who had reciprocal relationships with them, for they all worked in the same fields and traveled in the same public buses, could not see the rape. So, these reports, written solely in European languages, and here I lump the human rights report along with the refugee appeal, not because there's no difference in kind between them, but because these are fictive accords that work at annulling discordances, the genuine power differentials that make the translator necessary in that encounter. These accounts are wholly composed according to the terms and wishes of the dominant culture. The transliterated names of people and of places are there to give the account a veneer of verisimilitude. In fact, these reports are documents of conversion. Let me explain. In one of Shobha Sakti's short stories, Monsieur Mudulunga, that's the name of the story, a young Nigerian who works with an urbane Sri Lankan recounts his experiences to this officer of all that happened when he took his shy young bride to the movies. By the way, the title of the story is the name of this Sri Lankan UN functionary as pronounced by the Nigerian Mamudu. This is how Mamudu, who is trying very hard without much success to learn to speak English properly, describes the verbal dexterity of his new hero at the office. The planning officer speaks English in 10 different ways. He spoke with President Ansari in one kind of English. He spoke with the Irishman differently, with the Australian in another kind of English. With Maimoon, the woman who brings oranges to sell at our office, he spoke in a strange English without any verbs and only nouns. He had a special English to converse with me. He would open his mouth wide as if chewing on roasted meat and bite out the English words in tiny bits and send it my way. For the first time in my life, I was able to completely understand the spoken English of a non-Nigerian. When Allah gives, He doesn't ask whose child you are. Before the feature film had started, there had been, now this is his experience at the movie theatre. Before the feature film had started, there had been a series of advertisements that are surreal in effect to Mamudu, who tries to guess the product being advertised and gets it wrong each time. And while watching an ad for Nokia phones, which Mamudu initially thinks is for lipstick, as the participants on screen lick everything in sight, Mamudu turns towards his wife and begins to kiss her. Now I'm going to read from the short story. This is Mamudu's voice. I gripped Amina's face with both my hands so that she couldn't move and sucked at her eyes, nose, forehead, cheeks, and lips. The people in the theatre, one by one, gradually began to take note of us. Without stopping, I kissed Amina loudly and vigorously. Each of my kisses burst upon the theatre like a firecracker. By now, everyone in the balcony class was watching us. I was kissing Amina like a man possessed by lust. Amina, like a hen caught in the clutches of a cock, was fluttering her hands ineffectually. Without stopping my kisses, I looked around the theatre. The 30 million eyes were all upon us in the half-dark. I clasped Amina with my left hand and with my right hand picked up the Coca-Cola bottle from Amina's lap, held it over our heads, and yelled out from the bottom of my throat, "Enjoy Coca-Cola!" When Mamudu tells Monsieur Mudulinga the next day about the events at the movie theatre, he leaves nothing out. The key part of the narrative of how he waved the bottle of Coke around sends Monsieur Mudulinga into gales of laughter. A few days later, he calls Mamudu into his office and reads a story he had written about Mamudu's experience in Tamil. He then translates it into English to share it with Mamudu. The question might arise as to why Monsieur Mudulunga needs to recount this tale to Mamudu, as it is after all Mamudu's story. Well, listen to what Monsieur Mudulunga does to Mamudu's story. This is Mamudu speaking about the story. The dinner party Amina and I had attended at his house, the tickets to the movie he'd given us, the terror Amina had felt in the streets of Lagos, the way I'd blinked in confusion over not understanding the English of the popcorn-selling Chinese woman, the advertisements shown on the screen, the Renault car, the black coffee powder, the Gillette razor, the Nokia handphone, everything was as I had described. Except Monsieur Mudulunga had made a crucial change at the end of the story. According to Mr. Mudulunga's story, I didn't kiss Amina. But Monsieur Mudulunga had given the title of the story as Kiss. It is here that the significance of his creation lies. The story Monsieur Mudulunga wrote about Amina and me is as follows. Okay, now I'm going to read, but notice what Monsieur Mudulunga, a pox on his black heart, does to Mamudu's exhilarating story. Monsieur Mudulunga leaves out the 30 million eyes watching as Mamudu kisses his wife, waves his soda around, and so exuberantly claims the language of the globalized consumer culture that is beamed at him and makes it his own. Do take note of the similes Monsieur Mudulunga employs, as well as the narrative of loss he weaves out of his own education in the West's way of thinking about the savage without language. So this is Mudulunga's story. Mamudu's attention was in the advertisements showing on the screen. He was slightly disappointed that the advertisements had no dialogue. Annoyed, he turned towards Amina, who kept repeatedly looking at the screen and then down at the floor. When Mamudu touched her hands, they were burning like hot coals. When the advertisements were finished, the whole theatre went dark. In that darkness, Amina did something. Moving her Saudi pumpkin-like bottom, turning her head suddenly at a 90-degree, she placed her voluptuous lips on the dried, sea-worm-like lower lip of Mamudu. This was the kiss for which Mamudu has been longing for since their marriage a month ago. But Mamudu is in no mood to play love games with her. He was staring at the feature film that had started running on screen. His ears were standing at attention like a hunting dog's. On the screen, the white man's ship is coming towards the coast of Africa. The white men talk amongst themselves. Mamudu couldn't understand a word of what they were saying. Now Amina begins to rub Mamudu's cheek with her wet lips. But Mamudu was focused on the dialogue taking place on screen. Like the radio discovered by Marconi, Mamudu could function only on one bandwidth at a time. Amina began to kiss Mamudu's fingers gently. It had been 4 minutes since the film started, and almost 100 words had been spoken so far, and Mamudu couldn't understand a single. He felt deeply exhausted. He cursed himself for thinking that for an African from the village like him, the white man's English would never be comprehensible. Then he muttered to himself softly, "From the time of Adam, the donkey has been grey." Exactly 5 minutes after the film started, Mamudu got up from his seat and left the theatre. That was the moment Mamudu made a great mistake. What he didn't know was, in the first 5 minutes of the American film, all the characters spoke in Portuguese. And then he says, "I felt that the ending Monsieur Mudulunga designed for my story was appropriate, for Monsieur Mudulunga had started my story thus, quote, Mamudu's English sounds like bullock carts on the stone-paved streets of Cocoville." The tale of conversion is to allow one story to be taken and made to fit another's requirements. Mamadou agrees with Muthiya Mutulunga that this ending, one of defeat and humiliation, is a better one than the one that had really taken place. Mamadou's desire to become conversant in proper English is picked up by Monsieur Mutulunga and constructed into a far different story. As deeply sympathetic as he is, Monsieur Mutulunga is still a representative of the Western world, which believes in progress, property, and the proper way to use its language. Written in full acknowledgement of knowing the truth, for Mamadou tells him everything, Monsieur Mutulunga constructs a narrative that recasts Mamadou as a beast on the roads of his own village in Coqueville, Jaffna. So whom can you trust? If you can't trust a man like Monsieur Mutulunga to get your story right, can you trust the cold-eyed refugee officer? For the refugee, the format inhibits the emergence of a self other than the severely preordered. The inadequacy of the appealer is then justified as one of inability and lack rather than as a problem of the format itself. The rationalization of the form is an imperial alibi of domination, for it demands the refugee to perform a particular script that begins with the subject separating herself from her lived experiences. It is a situation that is profoundly alienating. First, there is a synthesized self-narrative that could at any moment be shown to be not accurate. And secondly, the narrative is to be translated into a European language. This alienation takes place, I would argue, when the narrative moves from the oral to the written, where a shared communal experience, maybe an aerial bombing, the arrival of the army, is then recast as an individual narrative. Though it is commonplace to remember where one was when a catastrophe took place, like I was feeding the animals when I heard the gunshots, and keep repeating it each time the experience is vocalized, the oral narrative allows for the inconsequential, the lapses of memory, the irrational. In the written version, the model developed in dealing with a non-Westerner, from the time of the colonial period, the kinship narrative is refused in favor of a singular linear plotting of events where time and place is carefully noted. Linguistically, the alienation begins with the inability of the speaker to present her story directly. The refugee has her appeal written out in an alien language, either through the help of a stranger or an acquaintance conversant in both the languages and officialese. The refugee is a figure composed by the problems of translation. Unable often to speak in the language of the host nation, unless there is a translator present, the refugee is made to recognize the procedural necessity of a written appeal. At this point, the alienation is doubled, for the format of the appeal is inadequate for an oral translation. The application demands an act of unambiguous identification. I am a Sri Lankan Tamil. It continues the alienation the refugee feels towards his own experience by making him naturalize the violence in the very linguistic structure of his narration. The details about aerial bombing, the evacuation of whole villages, are presented in the manner of a weather report. At 7 in the morning, and it's in the appeal, in the morning, covered in masks, the Indian army came to my house. The worst part of this process is the assumption of a particular subject position, that of the unwitting victim, deserving of the West's pity and generosity. The process stages a familiar East-West transformation, where the refugee is made to deny any kind of agency in his life so far. The monotonous voice of the appeal testifies to the refugee's willingness to let go of the particular, that which comes from elsewhere, in a word, the metaphor. The refugee is implicitly promising to assimilate, share the values of the host nation, and learn its ways of being. It is an act of diminution, where the refugee occupies a lower position, signifying in every way to acquiesce. The refugee application rehearses the homogenization that is to come, and what gets obscured in what is otherwise a procedural matter, in the name of differentiation we need to differentiate between the genuinely needy from the pretenders, is the universalization that takes place in these intracultural moments. And it's enforcing this universalization, where all refugees are the same, the alienation of the refugee is complete. The host country is a civilized country. It makes clear in that moment of encounter at the border that the relationship between the refugee and the state is a political one and not a human one, to be mediated only through the strict letter of the law. The conflicts that the refugee is trying to escape are unknown here. The refugee therefore needs to explicate in terms and a language not her own the monsters she's fleeing from. It is as if the host nation has no experience with such conflicts. So it is up to the addressor to translate into the language of the host nation a savagery that is incomprehensible to the putatively civilized interlocutor. Driven by philanthropy, liberality, and civilization, the host country's past or present experiences with regional or colonial conflicts are never brought into question. At no point is the refugee's narration to remind the host nation of its own policies towards its indigenous populations, prisoners, or the poor. The format, with its insistence on non-figurative language, calls for a similar diminishing of the refugee herself. The prohibition against figurative language, a suspicion of the West against ornamentation in speech in general, has been with us at least since the time of Plato. In the Renaissance, the word translatio itself meant figure of speech, metaphor especially. If we think of the director of the Office of Refugees placing these narratives in a machine to run it through its various diagnostic instruments to arrive at a decision of acceptance or rejection, it will help us understand these prohibitions against certain kind of rhetoric. If we think of the process as machine-like, of a translation machine that cannot deal with linguistic excess, then we understand the demand put upon the addresser to write clearly and cogently in a prose devoid of unnecessary divergences in the way of figures of speech. If war, as Elaine Scarry argues, is an experience that engenders, quote, verbal unanchoredness in its sufferer, the translation machine of the Office of Refugees disposes of such a description in its severe reasonableness as fanciful and useless in practical terms. Scarry's description of the war experience is metaphorical, calling to mind a ship tossed in an unmoored state. It reminds us of those boatloads of refugees refused entry at every port. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. I think we have a few minutes. I should have said this at the beginning, but we have a few minutes, as we usually do, for question and answer. And I think that we have a hand mic going around for anyone who might have questions.
Yes. I was really struck by two parts of it. I was very struck by two of the situations you described. One being the upper caste women,
right,
and responding to the
right,
Dalit women, and this entire translation, being edited and redacted by the Indian editors of this book. I'm thinking of, it seems like there are two contrary kind of dynamics in these two situations, in that the book, as read by the Western reader, would appeal, I think, to some kind of liberal guilt on the part of the reader, that this is what our governments do.
Right.
And for the Indian editor, that particular emotion is not at, to be sold to the reader. Not quite at least. So I'm thinking of that kind of liberal guilt, or the guilt that the person in a position of power. Feels. That doesn't seem, that seems to be missing in that interaction that happened between the Dalit women and the upper caste women. I mean, it's not the case that the upper caste women would somehow be more willing to believe the Dalit women. Or
because there will be a real effect if they did believe, right? The dominant caste women in the village who denied that there is rape, that if they were to say yes, then they have to look at the rapist, right? That is, go home, right? So it brings it home in a way that the appeal also does the same thing. I mean, this I just came back from India, and the Assam violence is going on. 3 different magazines from the same month. This is August, okay? Look at how these one is a Tamil magazine. This is India Today, and this is Outlook. They all have innocent victims. We love the innocent victim, right? I mean, children and crying women. And one is a crying child. I mean, this is the image that, like you said, the liberal, where you really don't need to reflect too deeply, right? So when Anthony Dasan, who's not innocent. What do you do with the not innocent refugee? What do you do when it is not so simple, when it is a complicated issue? Like the Dalit women, very similar in that they are asking these other women to acknowledge that rape takes place between their men and themselves. And if the upper caste women were to say, "We believe you," yes, that might be true, then they have to go home and deal with it, right? So it's
immediacy of the encounter.
Right. And my point when I say that for translation to happen, so many other things have to happen for translation to happen too. There has to be a willingness to hear the tale that is being translated. Right? I mean, the English editors of by the way, they made a huge mistake. I mean, a lot of things that they did with the novel was problematic, all in the name of the liberal English reader, who might find a topic like this meaningful, but will not really ask him to make the effort to read a complicated novel. So in the name of a linear narrative, they took out a lot of things that they found to be problematic about the novel. So this is the same kind of, you gesture to it, but you don't want to actually acknowledge it.
One more question?
Yes.
There's much in here. We can talk later, but just on this last thing about, the publication history of this novel. Did the author agree with the cuts?
Yes. Now you have to remember, he's a very interesting person in terms of, you have to learn so much from him. For him, the writing of the novel, and he published it in Tamil, that it's out of his hands. It has gone away. And anyone who asks to translate, he says, yes, I don't care what you do. And he really doesn't care about, once the novel has gone, what happens to it. It's simply out there. And I was the one who was very upset about the decisions made. Traitor, by the way, Penguin was excellent in that. Traitor, nothing was cut out.
I'm trying to get to the theme of kind of the authority of an original.
Right.
And it seems, last year, Gyan Pandey gave a talk in relationship to the number of different versions of Narendra Jadav's book.
Right.
And in fact, there's been so many, the publication history of this supposedly Dalit autobiography is such that there's no longer a book there.
Right.
There's just a series of tellings.
Right.
And so we're in a kind of different world from the production of a book by an author, published by a publisher, read by a reader, that then can be taken into another language as such.
Right.
With all of the problems in that. And we've got something else.
Right.
So that there's no longer, if the author himself is kind of putting his work into a different context, whatever you do with it is fine.
Exactly.
And then this kind of, so for me, the problem with that reality, which I think holds for a lot of what I see going on in the subcontinent. And we can go back to the 500 Ramayanas. Controversial essay that's been in the news recently. But if that's all the case, then this framework that I guess, you're very committed to, going back to whether it's Aristotle or Plutarch or Sophocles.
I'm Western educated, right?
Well, but you're taking theories that relate to texts that do certain things, where these are this is a completely different reality. There's not a text there. There's not an author there. There's not a rhetorical project there. Do what you want with it.
No.
Retell it.
No.
And so it's not a matter of, of the whole frame of what either drama or writing is.
Right.
From a Greco-Euro tradition. I mean, it's just there's some problem here that there's a larger problem of translation. Are we going from different media, from different kinds of cultural products?
I don't know. I don't know whether it is really very different. I think his response to not being offended comes from his understanding of himself as a refugee. He lives such a marginal existence with, he lives as a stateless person where he does not even possess a passport. So for him, this kind of, what a Western educated editor in India does with the translation of the novel that is deeply meaningful to me is not as meaningful to him. You get what I'm saying? I mean, to him, he's so marginalized that this is not something that he needs to worry about right now, because this is who is reading this? Who is his reader? His reader is so far away from him. The English reader to him is so far away from who he is. He understands very, very little English, by the way. That it's incomprehensible to him to even visualize that English reader. When I send reviews and what people have said, it is irrelevant in a lot of ways. For him, what is real? This is real. This is real, which is also a piece of fiction. I mean, all the refugee appeals that people sit and invest time over are pieces of fiction. So the way they understand genre, I mean, somebody like Shobha Sakti will understand genre, is very interesting.
I thought you've made a persuasive point on.
Right.
On that. Can you say a little bit about the Tamil response? The novel was published
in 2001
or outside of India?
No. Everything is published in India. So it was published in 2001.
And what was the response?
Oh, the response was very good. It was received very well, because nothing had been written in Tamil as literature before that. I mean, you have to remember that the war has been going on from, for 20 years before that. And India had been dealing with this issue off its coast. For South India has been dealing with refugees coming, and also the violence overflowing into South India. So here it is, finally, a novel about it. So there was a lot of positive response. Also, the fact that as a gorilla itself has a very appealing protagonist, a 15-year-old boy who goes to war and who has problems with his father. I mean, it's not just a guerrilla novel. It is also, a novel in this, a Bildungsroman, which it is a Bildungsroman, no question about it. So it appealed in a lot of ways, and the responses were excellent. I was surprised that it wasn't translated. When I read Monsieur Mudulinga in a new Tamil, one of those new Tamil magazines that came out just 2 issues. I mean, this is one of those small magazines that comes out and then dies out. And I read this, and I thought it was real. I mean, I really thought that he creates this scenario. The first paragraph is, Shobha Sakti says, I came across this story written by the Nigerian writer Mammudu in Le Monde, and I thought it would be very interesting, so I translated it into Tamil. So then I went and searched for the original. I mean, your question about the original. So I went and searched for the original, and then I asked, people in my university who did work with African novelists, who is this short story writer called Mammudu? They said, we've never heard of this person. So then I went back to the magazine and found the email for Shobha Sakti, and he emailed him and said, where did you find this story? And then, he just one line, he said, call me, and sent me the number, because he couldn't read the English big paragraph that I had written about how effective I found the story, which was complete misreading of the story in Tamil that I had done, because I thought it was a real story. So then then I talked to him, and he said, oh, that's a very postmodern story where and he used the Tamil word for postmodern. I mean, I've never heard anybody actually use that I mean, I've seen it written, but he used that particular word. It's a very classic word. And he used that, and he said, and so it was, there's no Mahmud. I mean, that's what the whole thing was made up. And so, which kind of shifted the story around for me, which is, again, translation. But when I say, even an expert translator cannot translate. I mean, if I had translated that story without speaking with him, trying to find the original, whatever, and I'm to come up with a very different story. I had to speak with the speaker in order to find. I mean, I needed a mediator, and so happened he was the mediator. So it's the notion that somehow translation will save us all, that we will have all these real documents that are real, full documents, is not true.
Thank you. I think we need to...
One more question.
You mentioned Bakhtin, the vocality of the state. Right. So that made me think of something. The other part of Bakhtin is the multivocality.
Right.
So it seemed like you were saying that this kind of genre that a deposition has to fit into diminishes.
Right.
But I was thinking, we were talking about MIA earlier at lunch, right? So I was thinking, what about the other side of, doesn't translation offer possibilities for these multivocalities to proliferate in interesting and unpredictable ways?
Right. But
like you were saying, the author, once it goes out of his hands,
right, it turns into something else.
It turns into, in the Derridian sense, a piece of writing. Once it's left, it's
right. It changes and it transforms.
Well, it opens up to new possibilities of interpretation.
Right.
So isn't there also that possibility of what we might call a misreading of a translation also offers different opportunities?
Beautiful readings. The weird thing was after I read, I was so amazed by this short story. I never read anything like this, right? So I even before I started translating, I was writing something else, and half my paper, like about 10 pages, I talked about the very thing, this story that is, goes from, Nigeria to Paris, and from Paris into Tamil. I mean, oh my God, this kind of circulation of stories. Then after I talked with him, I had to go and, press delete in my paper, take everything out, because it was so meaningless, because that's not what, the minute he told me. I mean, that's a very valid reading I made anyway, right? Yeah. But the minute I found out, oh, no, this is not what the story is. And when I translated, my latest project was Tamil Dalit poetry. I went and met the poet himself, and then he answered questions, etc. Then I do the translation. I did the translation in St. Louis, sitting at my computer, and then it went to Delhi to the editor, and the editor got Ravi Kumar, who had been a magazine editor who published this particular poet's poems first. So the person who edited my translations was Ravi Kumar. So he was a member of the Legislative Assembly at that time. So I would call him in the morning, and Ravi Kumar would get up. I would wake him up in the morning because we're editing over the phone, and he would get up, and then I'll tell him, okay, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. Go have a coffee or something, and he'll come back, and then he will sit and cough for 10 minutes, right? And then we will start our work. And it was so interesting how the editor who had edited this Dalit poet's work would then edit and kind of misread what the poet himself had told me. So we would have these intense arguments over the phone where I would say, but when I asked him that, he said this is what it means. He said, that cannot mean that, right? He would say, that cannot mean that. That is not what is meant by that word. I said, well, when I asked him, this is what he said. So then, now the ball is in my court. I have to decide whom do I go with the editor or with the writer. The editor who feels that he was the one who polished, he really felt that he had polished this Dalit writer's works. I mean, they're both Dalit, by the way, so it's really complicated at how many circles it goes, how this translation worked. And in the end, the larger editor and I would have this conversation again, and then we would say, okay, do we go with this or do we then go with that? And very often I would go with the poet, again and again go with the poet, even though that might complicate the reading. And Ravi Kumar was very unhappy over the whole thing. I mean, and the reason why he was unhappy was because he felt that the Dalit poet had not done what he could have done. I mean, he didn't explore that enough because, for whatever reasons, he hadn't done in exploring this enough. So he was very angry over that too. I told him to do this and he didn't. So it was very interesting when it comes to how texts get translated. Who mediates, right?
Well, it comes back to, I think, what Lee was saying about ultimate authority. When the text goes out into the world.
Right.
Well, in this case, there's no author. The editor did the polishing.
Right. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, these were the discussions. I mean, very real, life-changing discussions, right? Because the poet Rajkumar cannot read English. So whatever we publish out here is going to be the definitive edition. And that's going to, go into anthologies, right? And because he's published in these tiny magazines here and there, little chapbooks here and there that have gone out of print, to go find the original would be impossible in another 5 years, right? So what exists is this authoritative English version published by a large publication that is then will go into anthologies and get taught at universities, the English version.
You never think of publishing your translation with the original on one side?
That's a whole production issue, right?
Not in European languages.
No. I mean, in terms of money, the publisher who published is a small publisher, right? So for him to be able to do that, to place it again, will be very expensive.
I'm referring to your translation.
Right. The poetry?
Yeah.
Next to the English one? No, that's the thing I'm saying. If it is published by, let's say, Random House, they can do it. Yeah. But not by Navayana, who published it. It was a small publication. They were very clear. 500 copies, this is how much how much money we have to do this. So, which is...
Again, this comes back to the focus on agenda
right.
of the mediator
right,
or the editor,
right.
And really it's the editor who finally gets
totally, right.
And that kind of reminds me of Taha Muhammad Ali from the Palestinian poet,
Mm-hmm.
and Peter Cole, who did
The translation.
We had them at the MFA program. They came and talked, and it was very interesting to watch the dynamic between the two of them, because he could only speak through Peter Cole,
Right.
even at the talk.
I know.
And sometimes it was heartbreaking.
Right.
Watching that
Right.
tug of war.
Right. And what the translator decides to tell is that matters, right? If the translator thinks...
And what we hear is through Peter Cole.
Right.
And that's it.
Right. If the translator does not know to translate that word, who cares, right? Really? I mean...
And then again, what the editor is allowing.
Right. Now the decision that the production should come out in a particular way was completely editorial, because there were 3 poetry books coming out. Poetry books don't sell at all. I mean, that's how it was explained to me. You will, yes. So it is as bad as a vanity publication. So beautifully produced books with lovely Dalit artwork, but no, you can't really extend anything else. And he the particular editor, kind of did everything he can to, create excitement out. It's coming out kind of a thing, big excitement, in order to bring this out. And he packaged it together with 3 other books so that they could sell them. I mean, this is a concern. I mean, the question of what gets published in what form is decided elsewhere. Thank you.